Professor Dimitrijevic, who's going to talk about coming to terms with collective crimes, responsibility as acknowledgment.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for the privilege to speak at your conference. I don't know how close my topic is to your academic and professional interest, but my friend Judith Shandor told me that it should be okay or it could be okay. And as ever, I trust Judith's judgment. So if it still does not work, then I apologize in advance for wasting 45 minutes of your lives. We certainly share a commitment to the question of the ethics of responsibility and the challenges that arise in the wake of human suffering. My field of interest are moral and ethical import of mass atrocities. By way of introduction, let me just learn how to use this. Sorry. Yeah, some raw data. It comes from a Sheriff Bassiouni book published in 2011, and it's about wars, insurgencies, ethnic unrest, and other types of oppressive actions after 1945 up to 2008, and this is the number of people killed in those conflicts. And Bassiouni says if you add up the number of people who died in consequence of those conflicts, you end up with these numbers, which is a lot. Or consider some well-known facts about the Bosnian War. During the Siege of Sarajevo, from 92 to 96, the city population was exposed to the continuous bombardment and the sniper fire by the Serbian army. Some 12,000 people were killed in Sarajevo. Among them, I think some 600 are children, Nevena will know better, children younger than 15. In July 95, in the woods around the Bosnian town of Srebrenica, the Serbian army executed some 7,000 men, and many of those killed were underage boys. Now, I remember my first visit to Sarajevo after the war. It was in the spring of 2011. I went to the Markale marketplace, which is the site of the two massacres committed by the Serbian army in February 94 and in August 95. I read the names of people who were killed on that marketplace. They were 141, and from that personal experience, I remember mostly emotions: sadness, embarrassment, shame, and hopelessness. I felt the same 4 years later when I visited Srebrenica. It may be plain that my personal memory is linked to what happened to some other people. But Markale and Srebrenica, as particular places of memory, keep haunting me, not simply because I'm a member of the human race who feels duty-bound not to forget the killing of fellow human beings. I am ashamed because I'm a Serbian. And I remember what some other people, other Serbs, did in my name. Some of my co-nationals acted on the assumption that I would be better off if those children, women, and men whom I had never met would not live on earth anymore. And so they were killed. Had it not been for a certain ethical reading of my good as a member of the Serbian nation, they would still be alive. After such wrongs, to which we are connected without necessarily being wrongdoers, we have to revisit some basic ethical questions. What should we think and how shall we feel about what happened? How should we perceive our place in the world? What should we do? And here is a set of claims I want to explicate and share with you. They are, I think, some of them are pretty straightforward, and some of them are less straightforward, but none of them is easily accepted. Here is one straightforward claim. Post-criminal society, its regime, and citizens are duty-bound to explicitly acknowledge that what happened was wrong and unjustifiable. And you won't find too many societies in which this kind of coming to terms with the past has happened. And the second claim is that this acknowledgement should go beyond legal and political accountability. It requires asking the question of moral responsibility. And the third claim is that if certain conditions are met, then all members of a non-voluntary group we call the nation, in whose name the mass crime was committed, share responsibility. Now, what certain conditions are, I will explain in a moment. The reference point, the point of departure, is mass crime. Mass crime is a descriptive category, it's not a legal concept. This is just an improvisational definition. It's about killing, torture, expulsion, destruction of property, deprivation of basic security, and related forms of grave violations of human rights and basic human dignity. Now, another improvised concept is that of collective crime. This is the concept that I try to make sense of, and for which I have been mercilessly criticized by people. Somehow I still believe I'm right, which is probably due to this, academic vanity or whatever. So this is a practice envisioned, organized, and performed by some members of a group in the name of all members, with the support of significant number of the group members, and against individuals who are targeted because they are members of another group. Think about the Nazi regime. It fits. Think about the Serbian regime under Milosevic. It fits. In order to make sense of this concept, I would like to show you some of its features. It is a coordinated intentional action. It is well planned. It is organized. There is a division of labor among individuals, groups, organizations, political institutions. It's very important that wrongdoers never act in their own name. They act in the name of the whole group. Again, think of the Nazi regime. They acted in the name of the whole German group, right? Except that the German group was defined in a certain way, as Aryans and whatever. The regime always relies on the support of those subjects in whose name it rules. Very important for any kind of collective crime is that so-called ordinary people are very happy to support crime. So the word support stands for the support of criminal practice. I happen to know, given this joyful fact that I'm a Serbian, that so many Serbians were so happy to support killing of non-Serbs. And even today they are happy with that historical fact that so many non-Serbs were killed. So crime is ideologically, legally, and politically normalized, which means that political institutions, legal arrangements, values, attitudes, and everything that comprises the institutional and normative architecture of society are organized and accepted in such a way that life during killing is life as usual. Killing is routinized and normalized. And this is the core feature. Crime is ideologically justified by reference to the group-specific ethics, which means that those who join for the criminal purpose, who formulate and spread criminal intention, and who engage in criminal acts, justify each of these acts by referring to the identity of the entire group and to the alleged good of all of its members. I call it the ethics of evil. No collective crime has ever been committed without strong ethical justification. This is a very impressive historical and empirical fact. Go into the study of mass crimes, and there are many in the history of mankind. You will not find a single one which was not ethically justified. And the necessary feature of this ethical justification is the representation of the targeted group as the embodiment of evil. Again, think about the Nazi Germany, which is the classical example. It's not only that we, the Aryans, are good and that we have good ethical reasons to do what we do. The very presence of the targeted group is the threat to our ethical essence, right? Therefore, killing is justified. And that's what is very impressive when it comes to this type of crime. It is presented as something that is intrinsically good. Now, if I had to summarize the right attitude to the legacies of such crimes, I would insist on only on two arguments. One is that at the level of facts, all such crimes are simply killing and harming vast numbers of innocent people. At the level of interpretation, these crimes were wrong and none of them can be justified, which means this, that you cannot come up with any cultural, ideological, political argument that would defend such crime and that would explain killing. Now, you may say that this is overly simplified or that this is trivially obvious. If you tell me that this is simplistic, because the context of each historically known mass atrocity is actually very complex, socially, culturally, ideologically, whatever. I will not deny this complexity. I would only say that complexity of events and of conflicts is completely morally irrelevant. When it comes to killing innocent people, you cannot bring forward the complexity of the context. Or if you do this, something is wrong with your moral barometer. And this is what I tell to my people in Serbia, and they say that I'm moralistic or whatever. Anyway. Second, you may say that this is trivially obvious. Again, I have to repeat that, and you may even tell me that, look, I as a human being, I remember the Holocaust. I know about the Darfur, I know about Rwanda, I know about Srebrenica, and I think that I should remember it, and I will never deny that this happened. So this, what I'm claiming, relates only to those communities in which this happened and which were involved in different ways with the crime. What I want to say again is that you cannot find a single group, single society, and single political community which would not be engaged in colorful and long-lasting practices of denial of crimes. There is, you can do whichever amount of historical readings of genealogy or whatever mass crimes, you will not find a single case in which the group which was involved acknowledged the crime in its entirety. Why is so? Why is it so? The answer could be very simple. Crime is never a mere historical fact. It remains relevant as a source of challenges that affect us today. Challenges pertain both to the facts and their interpretation. What really happened? Why did it happen? Who did it and how? Was it right or wrong? Good or bad? Just or unjust? Does it matter or does it not matter today? If it matters, how it matters today? These are all questions that you will find in post-criminal societies. And they affect our culture, our shared identity, and the way we perceive of our future. The answers to these questions can be plain right or plain wrong. There is no middle ground. If I say, like, it was wrong to kill all those kids in Sarajevo, but we should never forget how complicated the causes of the conflict were, I am engaging in the practice of interpretative denial, and I am committing a terrible moral error. So you can only say it was wrong to kill these children, and it is unjustified. Whoever brings the complexity of the historical context to explain the death of the innocent children is committing a terrible, terrible moral error. At the same time, what the right attitude is and what the right perception of one's duties is remains the question of the perspective. Mass crimes creates new identities. What and how we remember and what we ought to do depends on who we are or where we stand after crime. We can identify three broad groups or three communities of memory. The community of victims, the human commonwealth, and this is the expression of Jürgen Habermas, we in the land of perpetrators. Those who belong to the community of victims, the thing is that the moral positions of these three groups are very different. Very different. Those who belong to the community of victims have the right to remember, accompanied by the right to demand that others remember. And, empirically speaking, they always remember. They don't have a choice. They cannot say to themselves, okay, I'm a survivor of Sarajevo siege, I'm going to forget. people who belong to the human commonwealth, meaning those who are not members of these two communities, have duty to remember what happened in Srebrenica or wherever, simply because those killed were as human as they are. Now, my focus is here, given that I belong here, and the starting point is that we are duty-bound to respond to evil. We have special ethical duties. For the purpose of this presentation, ethics denotes the group-specific standards of the good life. Each group to which we belong has its own standards of the good life. They are called ethical standards. Morality denotes universal normative standards of right. And my claim is that in the condition after collective crime, we should assign the advantage to ethics over morality. Which means that we in the land of perpetrators have special duties, and those duties are exclusive to us, because we have to respond to the challenges that are only ours. We have to assess good and bad in our attitudes, intentions, and actions, both during and after crime. Such response is required not simply because we share the group identity with perpetrators, but because perpetrators did what they did in the name of our shared identity. And this is what creates a very specific ethical condition of us who belong to the community of perpetrators. After Srebrenica, a personal ethical question for somebody who belongs to the perpetrators' community is, given how other people suffered because of me, what is that I ought to do? This is a personal question, and the answer is I can be regarded as a decent human being only if my attitude to those harmed in my name is the right one. Now the question is, what is the right attitude? What the right attitude is depends on where one stood during the crime. We should, among those who belong to the community of perpetrators, Germans, Serbs, we should distinguish among people who committed crimes, people who contributed to crimes as accomplices, people who were supportive, called them bystanders, the so-called ordinary people who voted for the regime or whatever, or who were just simply very happy with what was going on. And we should distinguish people who were decent. I cannot treat equally Nevena and somebody who contributed to crime. So the question is, how can I justify my claim that Nevena also shares responsibility for what happened? The thing is that the character of crime was such that it has created a new identity. This identity is crime specific, and we cannot, although we belong to a non-voluntary group, Nevena and I, we cannot avoid our responsibility for what happened. And this is what I would like to try to explain. So the primacy of ethical duties, which are duties to respond, to acknowledge that what was done in our name was wrong. This primacy of ethical duties can be further explained by bringing forward two arguments. One is the argument of what I call the argument of disrupted relationships. Before crime, we were a moral community. Assume that, right? Assume that we were like a normal, decent society in which different groups coexisted, and we knew that we were different, but we accepted the fact of this difference, and we didn't challenge this right to be different. However, what happened during the conflict is that two ethical communities were created by the practice of crime. So Serbs stood up and started killing Bosniaks and Croats because they were Bosniaks and Croats, which means that the moral relationship that used to exist among the group, within the society, stopped to exist. What we have after crime is that we are in new kind of thick ethical relationship. We have victims and we have those who share identity with perpetrators. The crime creates a new type of relationship. Before crime, you didn't know about victims and you didn't know about perpetrators. Now, these two categories are so powerful that they shape the overall social landscape. Who are the victims? Victims are a social group defined by suffering they experienced. They have a wide range of victim-specific needs, and these needs can be material and they can be moral. They are also typically exposed to post-traumatic suffering, including negative emotions that range from anger and contempt to fear. Such emotional attitudes are often poorly individualized. Many ethnic Bosniaks fear me only because I'm an ethnic Serbian. But at the same time, victims and members of their community know much more about my group than they know about any other group. One core feature of the victim's identity is the knowledge of the fact that they were targeted on my own behalf. And when I meet, and this is empirical insight, this is not cheap philosophizing. I'm not a philosopher, I'm a failed lawyer. So this is an empirical insight. Whichever Bosniak I met in these post-war years was very suspicious. So I had to open up, I had to go to that person, I had to say, look, I'm sorry. I'm sorry in the name of those, or instead of those who didn't say they were sorry, or who did those things to you. Call it mistrust, call it fear. So even if I never intended or did anything wrong, assume for the sake of the argument that I oppose the criminal regime, it would still be inappropriate for me to argue that I should be exempted from the victim's negative evaluation. If it were not for a certain ethical reading of my personal and group-specific identity, the dead would be still alive and the survivors would not suffer today. This makes me tainted and indebted to the victims. Once atrocities have been committed, the ideological manipulation of the regime that distorted collective identity cannot be seen as an institutionalized lie anymore. It has become a fact. What I'm saying is that you cannot, as a member, say, of a German nation after the war, say, well, you know, what the Nazi regime did was a heavy ideological manipulation that distorted the German identity. I had nothing to do with this. No, this heavily distorted identity killed millions and millions of people. In the name of that identity, this was done. And after the fact, you cannot say, well, this was all, you know, ideological manipulation. It's a fact, because in the name of that manipulation, so many people were killed. The second argument for the primacy of ethics is the argument of transformative justice. I'm talking about the duty of self-reflection of the members of the perpetrators group. Of course, our belonging to a nation is never a matter of choice. We cannot choose a nation. If I could choose, I would immediately make my choice and become a Swiss, right? But when confronted with the legacy of the crime committed in the name of our shared identity, we have to address the question, which is a strange question: who are we now? And here I'm basically following Jürgen Habermas, who says that the question is not simply what we as co-nationals in a post-colonial society have in common. The question reads what we ought to have in common. On which values should we choose, or which values should we choose as the legitimate communal ties? We have to make a very, very strange choice. The answer is that the burden of the criminal past requires a clear, radically new moral foundation of our new community. And this is transformative justice. We have to change our community completely. We have to choose alternative values and alternative arrangements on which we would build our future. Which means that transformative justice is a strategy of ethical and institutional discontinuity. This appropriation of the past through transformative justice works in the medium of memory. Memory is important, and here is, memory studies are huge and whatever. Here is one among many definitions of what memory means. It's a particular type of knowledge which preserves and reevaluates the past, and which is focused on the integration of thus mediated past into the present. It is important to know that personal, that shared memories work in interplay. It's important to know that memory is relational, meaning that the perception of the past is a matter of social communication. The memory is not how things were in the past. Memory is how we today, given our worldviews, interests, perceptions, how we make sense of the past. So we choose what do we do with the reading of the past. So memory is about reading the past for the present purposes. And memory of crime, again, has to confront many questions. What shall we remember and how? And all these things. You have to create this memory, right? It's not something that is spontaneously present after the crime. What is present in post-criminal societies are heavily distorted memories. Heavily distorted memories because people don't want to face the past. Read the sociological books about post-war Germany. You will be very much impressed how people were ready to, falsify the recent past in order to live normal lives after the fact. The same thing is in Serbia. Read whichever empirical studies or what's the word, opinion polls about what people know about what happened in Yugoslav wars in the 90s. In Serbia, you have the fantastic phenomenon that 22% of people claim to know that Sarajevo was under siege for 5 years. From among them, some 60% claim that this is not true. The same is about Srebrenica. So people don't believe. People pretend not to know. Now, this is a matter of sociology and social psychology or whatever. I'm not going to go into reasons for that. But these are the questions, and they are often answered in a completely wrong way. What is interesting here is that the facts are given, but our perceptions, evaluations, and narratives are matters of choice. When we say we remember genocide in Srebrenica, we don't reconstruct that particular event as it really was. We give it a meaning. We evaluate what happened then, and we assess its relevance today. Not all the meanings we can assign to the event are justifiable. And this is Habermas again. He says that remembering is a learning process. Remembering for us who live in such types of societies. And this is what is very interesting. He says, looking into the German experience with the Holocaust and with the way Germans dealt with the Holocaust after the war. The question is whether we can also learn from events that reflect failure of traditions. This is an interesting point because very often you would find, both in Germany and in other countries, after such horrifying events, that ideological engineers claim, oh, this was not really us. We are much better. We Germans, I don't know, are the nation of Bach and Mozart and Hegel and Kant, whatever, whoever, Thomas Mann. They claim that the best way to overcome bad legacies is to go back in history to the time before the crime and to revive the best national traditions. Habermas says, no, you can't do this. Technically, you cannot do this because you cannot pretend that Holocaust did not happen. it is also a morally wrong strategy, because if you just try to, isolate those 12 years of the German history, you simply are again doing something that is morally unjustifiable. So we cannot pretend that this did not happen. We have to focus on the bad episodes, and we have to see what can we learn from there. Which means that we have to choose to which moral community we will belong. This question of choice is very strange, because group members are of course still tied by the common culture, but all the features of that culture, rules, normative distinctions, customs, traditions, memories, are now impregnated by crime. Group identity in the post-criminal society is a crime-specific identity. And again, when I say this in Serbia, people jump on me. But this is, I think, a sociologically discernible fact. The identity of a nation is crime-specific. The question is, and okay, let me shorten things, because we started later, and I don't want to keep you for too long. The question is, where do we go from here? And I want to argue that choices are limited, and that the room for compromise is narrow. Individual and collective memories after catastrophe refer to the people who in different ways make or fail to make sense of what has happened recently. After the regime change, we can choose between stating that the collective crime does not ethically and morally matter, on the one hand, and acknowledging that it does matter, on the other hand. If the past is left unaddressed, or if it is thematized through political and cultural strategies of silencing, relativization, denial, we effectively choose the option of staying with the crime-specific identity. The second and the only right option is to explicate and acknowledge the suffering of victims. And I think that we are indebted to do justice to a fact that is both simple and morally ultimate. That fact is the absence of the persons who were killed and who would have been present had they not been denied the right to live. The fact that these persons are dead cannot lead to the conclusion that the lives they used to live are irrelevant today. Such an inference would be grossly unjust in light of the fact that nothing in the lives they led pointed to them deserving the violent death. Nobody has ever deserved violent death, right? Those killed in our name suffered the gravest possible injustice, and today it is our duty to restore their human dignity. So one question that sort of, if I were an international lawyer, I would work hard for establishing the right of dead people to human dignity. I think it makes a lot of sense. And there is one more thing that I would like to, that is obvious and trivial, but it is very important to be always remembered. These wrongs, these crimes cannot be righted. If you study transitional justice, you will see a lot of talk about reconciliation, apologies, forgiveness, making amends, restorative justice. I teach transitional justice in this school, and I'm always very skeptical about these concepts. The thing is that those people are dead, and there is nothing about this fact that we could ever heal, amend, or help overcoming, nothing to be restored or repaired. Which also means that our lives are morally impaired, and it will remain so. And this holds good for morally decent persons as well. So I did not intend, I did not contribute to, or I didn't support wrongdoing, but my moral burden is still present. I suffer a moral loss since the crime ties my identity both with the wrongdoers and the victims. The former killed the latter in my name, and this makes me morally tainted. Although I have not done it, it points to who I am, and it's a matter of human decency to live with that. And this is a matter which does not end up with the change of generations. And I wanted to speak also about this concept of acknowledgement, but I realized, as ever, that I talk too much. So I thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Dimitrijevic, for this very serious and powerful talk. So we're going to take a few questions. There is a question.
Thank you very much for the very fascinating talk and argument. While your argument is intuitively very compelling, I want to challenge it actually philosophically, because you're basically arguing that the sole membership of a group implies responsibility, and I have difficulties with that argument. Suppose I'm living in a street where many thieves live, and I didn't know that when I just went and lived there. And it happens 10 years later that everybody, all my neighbors, have been thieves, and there've been many burglaries and of stealing everything from everyone. And 10 years later it appears, and everybody's blaming my street for doing that, for being in a criminal street, and I'm a member of that group being on that street. Following your argument, me not knowing what was happening next to me, what was my neighbors were doing, and even if I knew that, not approving of what was going on next to me, still I have a responsibility to restore. Because my street is going to be responsible for the wrongdoing to the city, rightfully. Yeah. But I, as a member, as an ignorant member of the community, and also one that was not in the position to do anything differently than I did, I'm still responsible. Your argument has some similarity with the climate discussions, when some people argue that past generations, people living in the countries in the past generations would have a responsibility to restore actually the damages of the climate change, even though there was an ignorant. And that argument is partly founded on the fact that there has been a collective benefit. But in your argument, the benefit does not come back. So the benefit is not the one that is, you're not trying to substantiate your argument by a collective benefit, but there is still something else. And I'm searching for the other thing that would justify that collective responsibility.
Thanks so much. Very shortly, I spent some years suffering with exactly these questions, and I tried to write a book on that, and I know that collective responsibility is a strongly contestable concept. And what I try to argue is that it is, and then people jump on me and say it's impossible. So I try to say that I am developing an individualistic, liberal concept of collective responsibility. Of course, in the context of serious and analytically responsible philosophy, you cannot really do this. But there is also a powerful stream in philosophy which basically says that sometimes, in some type, and this is what I subscribe to, in some type of situations, you cannot really start with the character of the arguments taken in abstracto. Let me just mention Christopher Katz, let me also mention Bernd Williams, let me also mention Margaret Gilbert. So these are the people who basically say that we don't depart from certain philosophical assumptions or conceptual clarifications, we depart from the character of the context. So my claim is, and this is a bold claim, but I realize that I could be beaten easily for that, is that given the character of these atrocities, we need to have a concept of responsibility tailored to that. So the classical abstract concepts of individual, shared, distributive, non-distributive, whatever responsibility do not really work. And it is also surprising that this kind of approach is accepted even by people who end up with very, very analytically strict abstract arguments. One person who accepts this, although he completely disagrees with me, I think that I am hopelessly wrong here, is Michael Zimmerman, who is a very tough analytical philosopher and who does this responsibility stuff. Yeah. So yes, I cannot work with analogies, you know, simply because I think they don't. I know that this is a very legitimate philosophical strategy, but I don't think it works for me here. Yes.
There's a question. I don't know.
Oh, thanks for your talk. And I guess getting into another controversial area, I wondered whether you would see your approach applying to only violent aggression against others and violent death, or I'm kind of stimulated by the report that came out earlier this week in the UK called Death by Rescue, which is a criticism of the EU policies that by kind of a regulation and indifference or withdrawing of possible rescue approaches, that there's a responsibility for those for the deaths of those in the Mediterranean that weren't rescued last year. So what I'm wondering is, would you take your approach and apply it to kind of death by lack of action or death by regulatory structures, as opposed to only death by violence in the examples you brought up?
So, thanks so much. I wouldn't dare to go beyond this. I'm very heavily anchored in the context of mass atrocities, and then I assume that philosophers would respond to you and say, well, we need to make a distinction between, responsibility for action, responsibility for non-action, and things like that. No, I wouldn't dare to go beyond.
There is a question.
Thank you very much for the presentation and many questions. Something like, for example, how would you apply your theory of responsibility in terms of time? Does it apply to something that is happening now, or let me give you an example. American Indians. I mean, how far in the past would you go? And for how long should we feel responsible?
No, that's you take the example of. We can also take the example of Australian responsibility. Australians have the Sorry Day, which was established like some years ago. Sorry Day is for injustices inflicted on the Aboriginal peoples in 200 years ago. So it took them 200 years. So 200 years of denial, and then the generations of today are desperate. They say, oh my God, look what we did. Yes, this generational question is very important, and the character of responsibility would be changing, right? So you cannot say that, but it remains as an intergenerational moral duty. And it can remain so because it's not about causal responsibility. It's about our duty to respond in a proper way to what happened in our name. And it's always, in our name, even if new generations come. And this is why this Australian example is very good. They said, well, it happened, and then, generations and generations of Australians did not feel any responsibility, and now, after 200 years, today's generations feel responsibility. Yeah.
So, if we are thrown into ethnic groups by birth, and it stays with us through some sort of individual and collective responsibility of a special sort, it seems that, so would you agree that, so even if an individual does a lot to bridge divisions, expressing solidarity and recognizing past crimes and atrocities and the worst one, genocide, and even then, if her group or his group stays in a sort of bad state of mind, then that would still cast a shadow over that individual as well, because her or his personality would be still perceived as through the group belonging. So would you agree that one could sort of escape that in a way only if manages to turn around the whole community of hers or his? So as the source of that sort of responsibility and guilt comes from that her or his group, ethnic group, failed at certain point, act in a humanistic way, then full recognition of that may be the way to change that picture only. if it's understandable what I am
sure.
trying to say.
Yes, thank you, Peter. I think that you can use the German example. It's a society that, if you look at this in Germany today, you can and you have to agree that they did their best. The road towards this process of coming to terms with the past was very bumpy. There were all kinds of difficulties and whatever, but you can today say, well, this is a decent society that engages with the legacy of the Holocaust in a decent, very decent way, but they don't even think about, moving the Holocaust question to the museum. Once they tried this, it was the very infamous event when Helmut Kohl said I think it was in '86, he said, well, there are some of us who are who have the mercy of being born late, and maybe the time has come, he said, to bury the past and to start living as normal human beings. And he proposed that the SS troops killed in 1944 in Germany and the American soldiers killed in 1944 in Germany be buried together as a symbolic act of bringing the past to its end. This is the so-called Bitburg controversy. And of course, the people jumped immediately and said, you cannot do this. So this is the answer to your question. Even if you are now a decent society, you cannot say, okay, the character of the past has changed, therefore we are not duty-bound to look it as a living past anymore. No, it has remained, it remains living past.
Okay, we're going to take the last question because we need to close now.
Thank you very much for your wonderful talk, and I agree with you that ethnic cleansing and ethnic war had some specificity which would provoke a different attitude morally. And I think that, for instance, attacking the medical convoy in Vukovar, or when villager livers were also attacking one another physically, they extended the battlefield, and civilians were part of these fights, then there is a different moral treatment is necessary after such specific ethnic wars. But I'm wondering whether later on in the identity formation, would it be somehow still possible to acknowledge the moral responsibility, but in the same time de-ethnicize the identity? Because one of the reasons why this ideology was so profound and unfortunately so evil and resulted in mass violations of human rights in so many degrees, mass rape, for instance, and not respecting even basic humanitarian law, was because of the ethnic divisions were so powerful. So I'm just wondering whether your theory can be reconciled with the of an identity which is not just shaped based on the clear ethnic divisions, especially after such a war.
Yes, thank you very much, Judith. So this is a difficult question because, again, when I say things like this, people, not you now, but many people tell me, like, sort of intuitively, but you are defending something which is a kind of new collectivism here. You are blaming the whole nation or whatever. So I think that, unfortunately, the situation is such that in order to be a decent human being, a decent individual, you have to realize you're Serbian. For me, my ethnic identity, I mean, I'm not saying this is good or bad, but for me, my ethnic identity was never important. I just didn't care. So why would I care about, as Hannah Arendt would say, it's a matter of fact, right? That I'm Jewish, it's a fact. Why should I care about that?
Yeah, but identity it's very complex.
Of course.
You can be Jewish and German,
right,
and
exactly.
or have dual nationality.
Right,
so it's very
right.
complex.
Exactly.
Which identity matters here
Right.
in terms of responsibility?
The thing is that what matters here now, that's what I would like to argue, is not your ethnic identity, but the identity which is defined by this crime, which creates individual duty of each member of that group to somehow react, to somehow respond. So, and paradoxically, to go directly to your question, Judith, paradoxically, the only way to overcome this ethnic, primitive, tribal type of divisions is to speak out as an individual who belongs to that nation. So I'm not very happy that I have to speak as Serbian, but it's the only way to address properly after such events, after such evil, to address properly the complexity of identities and the complexity of situations.
Okay, I think we need to close now, but thank you very much,
Thank you.
Professor. And
Thank you.